Carbohydrates are a class of organic compounds made exclusively from carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The atoms are in a general ratio of 1 to 2 to 1, which means there are an equal number of carbon and oxygen atoms and twice as many hydrogen atoms in every carbohydrate. Carbohydrates can be categorized as simple carbohydrates or complex carbohydrates, and of course we'll start with the simple carbohydrates and make our way to the complex carbohydrates in our lesson today. The building blocks of carbohydrates are single sugar molecules or monosaccharides. The basic unit of all carbohydrates is a single sugar called a monosaccharide. Mono means one and a saccharide means sugar. Glucose is a common monosaccharide. Here's an example of the chemical structure of a glucose molecule. Single sugars like glucose usually have 5 or 6 carbon atoms that are formed in a ring structure. Notice the chemical formula for this monosaccharide is C6H12O6. At each point here where you see the ring joined, that is where you will find a carbon atom, except for that one, that's an oxygen atom. But here you have carbon, a carbon, a carbon, a carbon, a carbon, and then coming off as a branch is that 6th carbon. If you wanted to count all the hydrogens, there should be 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And if you wanted to count all the oxygens, there should be 6. We'll start here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens. If you were to simplify that, if you would divide through by 6, 6 divided by 6 is 1, 12 divided by 6 is 2, 6 divided by 6 is 1, and you would have that 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. Simple carbohydrates are often used as a source of energy. Each cell of this manatee's body requires usable energy to function. The plants it is munching on contain loads of carbohydrates, the source of the manatee's energy. Living things use carbohydrates. Specifically, they use the monosaccharide called glucose as a source of chemical energy. After ingesting them in various forms, living things digest and break down carbohydrates through a series of chemical reactions. A cow might eat grass, a hawk might eat a mouse, and a bacterium might decompose part of a dead mouse. In all cases, the food is ultimately broken down into glucose, the monosaccharide that provides chemical energy for living things. Glucose is the main carbohydrate converted into energy by living things. The monosaccharide glucose is central to all living things. Pay close attention to this molecule as it will reoccur throughout this course in key places. Glucose has a chemical formula of C6H12O6 and exists in 2 main structural forms, a boat shape and a chair shape. So far, you've learned that carbohydrates are broken down to generate energy. This process begins with glucose molecules, which makes them extremely important. In fact, a body converts carbohydrates, fats, and proteins into glucose, so usable energy can be produced. The word food, in its most basic sense, means glucose. Deoxyribose and ribose are monosaccharides found in DNA and RNA, respectively. Integral components of the molecules DNA and ribonucleic acid RNA are the sugars deoxyribose, a monosaccharide, and ribose, also a monosaccharide, both monosaccharides with 5 carbon atoms. Nucleic acids are the molecules that contain and implement genetic control over the cell. DNA contains the instructions for building proteins. RNA is integral to the synthesis of those proteins. Monosaccharides are an essential part of both. Disaccharides, such as sucrose, result when 2 monosaccharides form a chemical bond. Sucrose is the chemical name for table sugar, and it is widely used as a sweetener. When you eat sweet things, sucrose is most likely making it sweet. Sucrose is composed of a glucose molecule and a fructose molecule bonded together. When a carbohydrate is made of only 2 simple sugars, like sucrose, it's called a disaccharide. Di means 2, saccharide means sugar molecule. Fun fact, most plants do not make sucrose, but the ones that do, such as sugarcane and sugar beets, are very important commercially. Sucrose is harvested naturally from plants. Sucrose, by definition, again, is a disaccharide. Di means two. Saccharide means sugar molecule. It's made up of one glucose molecule chemically joined to a fructose molecule. Glucose is a monosaccharide. Fructose is a monosaccharide. And when you take one monosaccharide and chemically join it to another monosaccharide, you get a disaccharide, like 1 + 1 = 2. Lactose is also a disaccharide that you have probably heard of. It is the common disaccharide found in milk products. All mammals produce lactose for their offspring in the form of rich milk. Also called milk sugar, lactose is formed when a glucose molecule and a galactose molecule form a chemical bond. So finishing up lesson 2.12, simple carbohydrates are often used as a source of energy. All carbohydrates contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. The building blocks of carbohydrates are single sugar molecules. Monosaccharides and disaccharides are simple carbohydrates made of 1 or 2 sugars, respectively. Simple carbohydrates may bond to one another to make complex carbohydrates, which are the focus of the next lesson. The body converts proteins, fats, and carbohydrates into glucose, which is broken down in a series of reactions to produce usable energy for cells. I love this concept map. It's on page 10 of lesson 2.12. And it's really simple to read. If you want to put it into a sentence, it's easy to do. Simple carbohydrates include monosaccharides, which are made of one sugar molecule, and examples of monosaccharides are glucose, fructose, and galactose. Simple carbohydrates also include disaccharides, which are made of 2 sugar molecules and include sucrose and lactose. Complex carbohydrates, lesson 213, are polysaccharides and are made up of many simple carbohydrate molecules linked together. So again, complex carbohydrates are polysaccharides. The prefix poly means many. So it's telling you right in the name that a complex carbohydrate has many sugar molecules, thousands, right, chemically bonded together to form the polysaccharide or complex carbohydrate. Starch, cellulose, and another complex carbohydrate called glycogen are large molecules made of hundreds or even thousands of glucose molecules held together in different ways. These molecules store energy and provide strength and support to living things. Plants store glucose as starch. The potato fields of Idaho are powerhouses of photosynthesis, using the energy of the sun to produce glucose. Glucose is the sugar that is the key molecule in delivering chemical energy to cells. Plants often make more glucose than they immediately need, so what do plants do with all the glucose they produce during photosynthesis? Many plants store extra glucose as a molecule called starch. Starch is a complex carbohydrate made of hundreds of units of glucose linked together in a specific way. Because starch is made of glucose, you may think of it as stored chemical energy inside a plant. Plants store glucose as starch during times when energy is abundant. When energy is scarce, they may break down their starch, releasing glucose that then becomes available for the process of cellular respiration. When you eat plant parts where starch is stored, such as oats, potatoes, or rice grains, you eat this starch. Your body then breaks it down into individual glucose molecules. Cellulose gives plants strength and support. Looming overhead at more than 100 meters tall, the coastal redwood is the tallest living thing on Earth. What gives that tree the strength to support its leaves and branches at such great heights? The same molecule that makes up the rugged cell wall characteristics of all plants, cellulose. Like starch, cellulose is a complex carbohydrate made up of many molecules of glucose linked together. But unlike starch, plants do not use cellulose to store energy. Instead, plants use cellulose as a structural molecule. It forms the cell wall that gives plant cells shape and support. The glucose molecules in cellulose are held together with a different type of chemical bond than the glucose molecules in starch. This bond is much more difficult to break down, making cellulose an ideal structural molecule. Most animals cannot digest cellulose. Cellulose contains the same fundamental molecule, glucose, as starch, but the two complex carbohydrates have very different properties. Most animals cannot use cellulose as a source of energy because they don't have the enzymes required to break the bonds holding the molecules together. Cellulose, however, is still an important part of your diet. How can this be if you can't break it down for energy? Cellulose is sometimes called dietary fiber. Have you ever been told to eat at least 5 servings of fruits or vegetables every day? In addition to many important nutrients, fruits and vegetables are excellent sources of this dietary fiber. Just think of all the cell walls in a serving of spinach. Cellulose is an important part of your diet specifically because it is not digested. It passes through your digestive system and helps your system function effectively. Some bacteria and fungi actually can digest cellulose, though. If you've ever seen decaying logs on the forest floor, then you've seen one type of organism that can digest cellulose, fungi. Some species of fungi produce enzymes that break down cellulose. These fungi play an important role in recycling dead trees and other plants in the forest. Termites, insect pests that can damage homes and other structures by feeding on wood, have bacteria in their guts that break down cellulose. By themselves, termites cannot digest the cellulose in wood, but the bacteria in their stomachs produce cellulose-digesting enzymes. Without those bacteria, the termites would not be able to digest wood and get energy and nutrients from it. Animals like cows are also home to many types of cellulose-busting bacteria, which live in their stomachs. Animals store glucose in the complex carbohydrate called glycogen. Have you ever heard of athletes who carbo load by eating a lot of pasta before a race? By eating a lot of carbohydrates, they are forcing their bodies to store extra glucose in their muscles so it's available for them during long endurance sports. While plants store extra glucose as starch, animals, including humans, store extra glucose in a molecule called glycogen. Like starch, glycogen is made up of many glucose molecules bonded together. Glycogen differs from starch in being a more highly branched molecule than the starch molecule. Humans and other animals store glycogen mainly in muscle and liver cells. Like starch, glycogen is easily broken down into individual glucose molecules during times of energy demand. Those glucose molecules can then be further broken down so their stored energy can be converted into usable forms. So to wrap up, complex carbohydrates provide energy storage and structure for living organisms. Complex carbohydrates are large molecules made of many glucose molecules linked together. Like glucose, complex carbs are made of the elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Starch and glycogen are complex carbohydrates that provide a way for organisms to store energy in their cells. The complex carbohydrate cellulose functions as a structural material in plants, but unlike starch and glycogen, few organisms can digest cellulose. So I'm going to take us back one more time to my favorite thing in the world, graphic organizers, concept maps. Carbohydrates, right? The basics are macromolecule, one of our 4 macromolecules that we talked about in our CRQ the other day. They're made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. Carbohydrates can be simple or complex. Simple carbohydrates come in 2 flavors, if you will. You have monosaccharides, which are made out of 1 sugar molecule, and disaccharides, which are made out of 2 sugar molecules. Examples of monosaccharides are glucose, fructose, and galactose. Disaccharides are made up of 2 monosaccharides chemically joined together, and examples are maltose, lactose, and sucrose. You take glucose and fructose, you put them together, you get sucrose. You take glucose and galactose, you put them together, you get lactose. Complex carbohydrates are also known as polysaccharides. Poly means many, so complex carbohydrates are made out of many sugar molecules, not just one or two, but 3 or more. Examples of complex carbohydrates are starches, fibers, glycogen. Fibers would be something like cellulose. Plants store their glucose in starch molecules. Animals store their glucose in glycogen molecules. And then, like we said earlier, fibers are those structural polysaccharides that give plants the ability to stand up tall.